They say silence is golden. But when the man you've loved for 55 years is gone, silence isn't golden. It's the echo of everything you've lost. My children thought that silence made me weak, made me a fool. They didn't know that in the quiet, I was finally learning how to truly listen. It feels strange, telling a story like this. My Arthur, he was always the storyteller in our family. But he used to say that sharing our stories is how we keep the people we love with us, how we find a little light when we feel most alone. If you believe in that too, I do hope you'll subscribe and join this little community of ours. Goodness knows, we all need a place where our stories are heard. The old house here in Charleston is so quiet now. It's a beautiful quiet, I suppose. The kind filled with the gentle hum of cicadas in the late afternoon and the distant chime of the bells from St. Michael's Church. But it's a quiet without Arthur's booming laugh, a quiet without the sound of him turning the pages of his history books in the study. Every room holds a piece of him. The worn leather of his favorite armchair in the den still holds his shape. I can still smell the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco he used to keep in the little porcelain jar on the mantelpiece. He's been gone for 3 months, and for 3 months my children, David and Sarah, have been wonderful, simply wonderful. They show up every day, bringing me casseroles and making sure I'm taking my pills. David, my son, he's so much like his father, always has to have a plan, always needs to be in charge of something. Sarah, my daughter, is the practical one. She has such a good head for details. This morning, they arrived with 3 large cardboard boxes. "Morning, Mama," Sarah said, kissing my cheek. "We thought today would be a good day to start sorting through Dad's study. No need to rush, of course, but it's best to get ahead of these things." My heart did a little flip. His study, that was his sanctuary. I hadn't been able to bring myself to do more than just dust in there. It felt sacred somehow. "Oh, I said, my hand fluttering to my throat. "I don't know, dear, it feels so soon." "That's why we're here to help you," David said, his voice gentle but firm. He put an arm around my shoulder. "You just sit on the porch with some sweet tea and relax. We'll handle the heavy lifting. We'll bring anything important out for you to look at." And so I did. I sat in the wicker rocking chair, the one Arthur and I bought on our 30th anniversary, and I listened to the muffled sounds of my children dismantling my husband's life. The scrape of a box being dragged across the floor. Their low, murmuring voices. I told myself they were right. It had to be done, and it was too much for me to handle alone. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. So many of my friends, their children live so far away, but mine were here, taking care of their silly old mother. After about an hour, Sarah came out holding a stack of papers. "Mama," she said, pulling a chair close, "we found some of Dad's stock certificates and the deeds to a few properties. It's all very complicated." David came out right behind her, wiping dust from his hands. "It really is, Mama. Dad was a brilliant man, but he wasn't the most organized. We think we should start getting all of this into one place. Make a proper inventory." I looked at the papers she was holding. They were a mess of numbers and strange-looking seals. It was like a foreign language to me. Arthur had always handled everything. He'd say, "Now, Betty, you just focus on making this house a home. You let me worry about the numbers." And I had, happily. "Oh, goodness," I said, feeling a little dizzy. "I wouldn't even know where to begin with all that." "We know, Mama, and you shouldn't have to," David said smoothly. "That's what we're for. We'll take care of it, all of it." He and Sarah exchanged a look over my head. At the time, I thought it was a look of shared purpose, of love for me, a look that said, "We've got her. We'll protect her." It made my heart swell. My dear, wonderful children. They were being so strong for me. I looked at them, my David with his father's determined chin, and my Sarah with her sensible, intelligent eyes. They were taking charge, shielding me from the complicated, ugly parts of life after loss. I trusted them. I trusted them completely. "I don't know what I'd do without you two," I told them, my voice thick with emotion. And as they went back inside to continue their work, a feeling of deep, profound peace settled over me. I was not alone in my grief. I was safe. I was cared for. My family was here, and they would handle everything. I looked at David and Sarah, my heart just so full of love. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I told them, and I truly meant it. In the days that followed, they made my home their headquarters. They were a whirlwind of efficiency, sorting through papers, making calls, and speaking in a language of finance and law that I'd never understood. I tried to help at first, to offer them tea or ask questions, but they would just pat my hand and tell me to rest. "You've done enough, Mama," Sarah would say. "Let us handle this." About a week after they started, they sat me down in the living room for what David called a family progress report. He had a yellow legal pad on his knee, full of his neat, serious handwriting. Sarah sat beside me on the sofa, a comforting and solid presence. "All right, Mama," David began, all business, just like his father. "We've gone through most of Dad's primary accounts, and plain and simple, it's even more complicated than we thought. We're talking about multiple investment portfolios, several deeds to commercial properties I didn't even know he had, and the estate tax implications are, well, they're significant." He kept talking, using words like probate, capital gains, and asset allocation. The words flew right over my head, a swarm of confusing, buzzing insects. I must have looked as lost as I felt, because Sarah reached over and gave my shoulder a squeeze. "It's so much, Mama," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "Honestly, I don't know how Dad kept track of it all by himself for so long. It's a real mess." "Oh, my," was all I could manage to say. A feeling of being completely adrift was starting to settle in. It was one thing to lose my husband. It was another to realize how much of my world he had managed without me ever knowing. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about any of it, Mama," David said, giving me a smile that felt a little tight. "That's what we're here for. We're going to get it all sorted out for you." He said it like he was talking to a child who couldn't understand grown-up matters. And in that moment, I felt like one. I felt small and foolish, and so deeply grateful that my capable, intelligent children were there to handle things. It never occurred to me to feel insulted. I just felt protected. My blind spot, you see, was my belief in their goodness. I couldn't imagine my own children would ever look down on me. I could only see their actions as a shield to protect me from stress. "Now," Sarah said, leaning in, "we were talking last night and there's something we need to discuss. The will." My heart clenched a little. We all knew Arthur had a will. He was too meticulous a man not to. He had it drawn up years ago by his old friend and lawyer, Mr. Abernathy. "Mr. Abernathy is a lovely man, Mama," Sarah continued carefully. "A true Southern gentleman, but he's very traditional, old-fashioned. With an estate this complex, with all these modern investments, we think we need someone a bit more aggressive, someone who understands today's laws." David nodded in agreement. "We have a friend, a man named Trevor. He's one of the sharpest estate lawyers in Charleston. We had a preliminary chat with him, and he thinks he can simplify this entire process. Consolidate everything, minimize the tax burden, and just make it easier on all of us. Especially you, Mama." A flicker of unease went through me. Mr. Abernathy had been Arthur's friend for 40 years. They played golf together every Saturday. To cast him aside felt disloyal. "But your father trusted Mr. Abernathy completely," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And Dad was right to back then," David said smoothly. "But times change, Mama. The world is more complicated. This Trevor fellow, he specializes in this. It's all he does. It's not about loyalty, it's about getting the best possible advice to protect Dad's legacy, to protect you." He framed it all so perfectly. Everything they said was cloaked in the language of my protection, my best interests. How could I argue with that? I looked from my son's earnest face to my daughter's concerned one. They were so sure, so confident, and I was so tired, so overwhelmed. The idea of anything being simplified sounded like a lifeline in a stormy sea. "Well," I said, sighing, "I suppose you know best. It all sounds so very complicated." I gave them a weak smile. "I trust your judgment, dears." The relief that washed over their faces was visible. They had been expecting a fight, I think, but I had none in me. "Wonderful, Mama," Sarah said, her voice bright again. "We'll just have Trevor look into things, get another perspective. You won't have to do a thing." And with my permission, my blessing even, they took the reins. I had willingly handed them the power to steer my future, completely unaware that they were already planning to drive me right off a cliff. I just sat there, feeling exhausted but cared for, a fool wrapped in the warm, comfortable blanket of her own children's deceit. "Let them handle it," I told myself. "They're my children. They would take care of me." In the first few weeks, that belief was my anchor. I let them create their spreadsheets and talk to their fancy new lawyer. I felt a sense of peace. See, believing I had done the right thing by stepping back, by allowing my capable children to shield me from the harsh realities of the world. I, in my trusting nature, had mistaken their ambition for affection. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the house felt particularly empty. The steady drumming of the rain on the roof was a lonely sound. I found myself wandering into Arthur's study, a room I had mostly avoided. The children had organized it, and what was once a space of comfortable, creative chaos was now sterile and neat. Stacks of books were perfectly aligned. His collection of pipes was gone from the desk. It didn't feel like his room anymore. A wave of nostalgia washed over me, a sudden, sharp longing to see his face when he was young. I remembered a specific photo album, the one from our honeymoon in the Blue Ridge Mountains. I knew exactly where he kept it, on the top shelf of the built-in bookcase, behind a row of thick art history books. I pulled over the small library stool, my knees creaking in protest, and climbed up. My fingers traced the spines of the heavy books, the titles familiar and comforting. As I reached behind them to pull out the heavy, leather-bound album, my sleeve caught on the book next to it. It was a clumsy move. The large book tipped, knocking against the one beside it, and in a slow-motion cascade, 3 of the massive volumes tumbled from the shelf, landing with a series of loud, muffled thuds on the thick Persian rug. "Oh, goodness gracious," I whispered, startled. I carefully climbed down from the stool and knelt on the floor to gather them. As I lifted the last book, a large volume on Renaissance art that I knew Arthur hadn't opened in 20 years, something slid out from between its pages. It wasn't a photograph or a bookmark. It was a thin, crisp manila folder. It was out of place. My children's organizing had been meticulous. They wouldn't have left a stray folder inside a book. My curiosity, a feeling I hadn't experienced much lately, was piqued. I sat down on the floor, my back against the bookcase, and opened it. The first page was a letterhead. The name at the top seemed to leap out at me. Trevor Hayes-esque. Estate and probate law. It was their friend, the sharp, new lawyer. My heart gave a little flutter of unease. Why would a document from him be hidden in one of Arthur's old books? I turned the page. The heading at the top of the next document sent a chill through my entire body. It read, "Draft, Last Will and Testament of Arthur Pendleton, revised." Revised? How could it be revised? Arthur was gone. The words didn't make any sense. My hands began to tremble as I read the first paragraph. "Being of sound mind and body, but in full recognition of my beloved wife, Betty Pendleton's, limited experience and inability to manage complex financial affairs in her advanced years." My breath hitched. Inability to manage, advanced years. Arthur would never have used such cold, clinical language. He called me his wise owl, his steady hand. This wasn't his voice. This was the voice of a stranger. I forced myself to keep reading. The text blurred, but certain phrases jumped out, sharp and cruel as shards of glass. "A monthly stipend of $5,000 shall be provided for her ongoing care and personal comfort, to be disbursed from the estate." A stipend, an allowance, like a child. I was to be given an allowance to live in my own home from my own husband's money. Full and irrevocable control of the Pendleton family estate, including all properties, stocks, and liquid assets, shall be transferred immediately upon my passing to a trust, to be managed exclusively by my dear children, David Pendleton and Sarah Miller, as co-executors. The folder slipped from my numb fingers, the papers scattering across the rug. The room suddenly felt cold, the air thin. I couldn't breathe. This document was a coup, a bloodless legal coup, and I was the subject being overthrown. They saw me as a doddering old fool, incapable of managing my own life, someone to be pensioned off while they carved up the spoils of my husband's legacy. Every kind word, every helping hand, every concerned look from the past few weeks replayed in my mind, now tainted with a horrifying new meaning. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hall. Sarah. "Mama, are you in here? What was that noise?" Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. My hands shook violently as I scrambled to gather the scattered papers, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shoved them haphazardly back into the folder, and without thinking, slid the entire thing under the thick cushion of the armchair beside me. I pushed myself to my feet just as Sarah appeared in the doorway, a look of concern on her face. "Mama, are you all right? You're as white as a sheet." I forced a smile, my lips feeling stiff and unnatural. "Oh, I'm fine, dear, just a silly old woman. I knocked some books over, that's all." She looked at me, her eyes full of that F. Amelier practiced sympathy. But today, for the first time, I saw something else behind it. I saw the cool, calculating mind of a stranger. "It's a mistake," my mind screamed. "A misunderstanding. They were just exploring options. Protecting you, they couldn't." But as she helped me up, her touch feeling alien and cold, a new and terrible voice whispered back from a place deep inside me. "Oh, yes, they could. And they did." It was a misunderstanding. It had to be. My children would never, ever try to deceive me. The thought circled my mind for the rest of that day and into the next, a desperate mantra against a rising tide of fear. The folder, with its cold, cruel words, remained hidden beneath the armchair cushion. I was too afraid to look at it again, and too afraid to throw it away. I told myself there was a logical explanation. Of course there was. David and Sarah were planners just like their father. They were probably just exploring a worst-case scenario. What if my mind started to fade? What if I got sick and couldn't make decisions for myself? This stipend, this trust. It wasn't a cage, it was a safety net. They were simply being proactive, trying to protect me. They just hadn't found the right way to tell me yet. Yes, that had to be it. It was a clumsy, misguided attempt at love. Armed with this fragile shield of denial, I decided to look for proof. Not proof that they were deceiving me, but proof that they weren't. I just needed one kind word that wasn't condescending, one open conversation, one look that didn't feel like they were assessing a problem. I became an observer in my own home, a quiet ghost watching the living, desperately hoping to see the children I knew and loved. But the more I watched, the more the veil lifted. On Friday, David installed a new television for me. "It's simpler than the old one, Mama," he said. He stood next to me, holding the remote. "Now, look here," he said, pointing, and his voice slowed to a crawl as if he were speaking to a 5-year-old. "The biggie red button turns it on. Can you try that for me?" I pressed the button. The screen flickered to life. "Very good," he said, with the same enthusiastic tone I once used with him when he'd learned to tie his shoes. Before I found that folder, I would have thought it was sweet of him to be so patient. But now, with the phrase inability to manage complex affairs seared into my memory, his tone felt like a pat on the head for a clever pet. I felt a hot flush of shame, but I just smiled and said, "Oh, thank you, dear. That's much better." The next day, I walked into the kitchen as Sarah was on the phone, her back to me. She was laughing about something. "I know, right? It's almost too easy," she said. Then she must have heard my slippers on the linoleum because she stiffened. Her laughter cut off abruptly. "Hey, I have to call you back," she whispered into the phone and hung up. She turned to me, her smile a little too wide, a little too bright. "Good morning, Mama. I was just making a hair appointment." The lie was so bald, so unnecessary. My heart did a slow, painful turn in my chest. Who was she talking to? What was almost too easy? My mind, the one they thought was fading, was starting to connect the dots with a terrifying clarity. Little things, moments I would have ignored before, now felt like clues in a mystery I didn't want to solve. When I mentioned I'd like to donate Arthur's collection of first edition novels to the university library, a wish he had often expressed, David just smiled indulgently. "That's a lovely thought, Mama, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to have them properly appraised first. They could be very valuable." My husband's wish, my opinion, was dismissed as a sweet, childish notion. The only thing that mattered was the value, the money. The feeling of being cared for was slowly, sickeningly, twisting into the feeling of being managed, handled, contained. The house no longer felt like my sanctuary. It felt like a beautifully decorated cage, and my children were the smiling, gentle zookeepers. The final, brutal shredding of the veil happened on Saturday. It was a beautiful, sunny afternoon, and I had escaped to the one place that still felt truly mine, my garden. I was on my knees, tending to the roses Arthur had planted for me, the scent of the blossoms a comforting balm. The window to Arthur's study was open, and I could hear David's voice, clear as day on the still air. He was on the phone, presumably with Sarah. "No, she hasn't mentioned the document," he said, his voice relaxed and confident. "I told you she probably wouldn't even understand it if she read it. It's all legalese." There was a pause. I froze, my gloved hand hovering over a weed. "Look, just be patient," he continued. "I'll get her to sign the power of attorney papers by the end of the week. She'll do it, don't worry." He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "She trusts us implicitly." She trusts us implicitly. The phrase struck me with the force of a physical blow. He said it not with gratitude, not with the weight of responsibility that such trust should carry. He said it with the smug confidence of a con man describing his mark. My trust wasn't a precious gift to them. It was a tool, a weakness to be exploited. It was the key they were using to unlock my life and steal it from me. The pruning shears fell from my hand, landing silently on the soft earth. The beautiful roses, the warm sun, the sweet air, it all disappeared. All I could feel was a profound, soul-deep cold. There were no more misunderstandings to cling to, no more justifications to build. There was only the truth, stark and ugly and undeniable. They thought I was a fool, and they were counting on it. She trusts us implicitly. My own son's words echoed in my head as I knelt in the dirt, the scent of the roses suddenly cloying and fake. For the rest of the day, that one sentence was my constant companion. It was a ghost that followed me from room to room in the quiet house, poisoning every memory, tainting every familiar object with the stain of deceit. My trust had not been a treasure to them. It had been a strategy. The grief for Arthur, which had been a heavy but warm blanket, was now pierced by a new kind of grief, one that was sharp and icy cold. It was the grief for the children I thought I had, for the family I thought was my sanctuary. I had been living in a beautifully constructed play, and I was the only actor who didn't know it was a tragedy. The next morning, they arrived unannounced. I was in the kitchen, staring into a cup of tea I hadn't touched, when I saw David's car pull into the drive. They came in bearing gifts, a box of pastries from my favorite bakery and bright, false smiles. It was an ambush of kindness, a tactic I was now beginning to understand all too well. "Mama, we have wonderful news," Sarah chirped, placing the box on the counter. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I had helped them with their homework, where we had celebrated countless birthdays. David, with an air of great importance, slid a thick manila envelope in front of me. "Good news, Mama," he said, his voice smooth as butter. "Trevor, our lawyer, has found a way to make everything so much simpler. This is just a straightforward power of attorney form. We had him draw it up." Sarah leaned in, her face a mask of earnest concern. "All this means, Mama, is that we can handle the day-to-day bills for you. We can talk to the bank, pay the utilities, manage the insurance. It just takes all that boring, stressful paperwork off your plate so you can focus on healing. And on your garden, of course." They were offering to take a burden off my shoulders. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. They spoke to me with such patience, such gentle condescension, their words wrapping around their true intentions like ivy around a dead tree. I looked down at the envelope. It was heavy. It did not feel simple. It felt like a tombstone. In my mind's eye, I saw the other document, the fraudulent will, hidden just one room away under the cushion of my armchair. I saw the words inability to manage and stipend. They thought I was a fool. They were sitting here, smiling, asking me to sign the official surrender of my own life. A new feeling, one I hadn't felt in a very long time, began to uncurl in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just fear. It was a spark. A tiny, hot spark of defiance. It was the part of me that had raised 2 children and buried a husband and run a household for over 50 years. It was the part of me they had forgotten existed. David pushed the document out of the envelope and slid it across the table towards me, followed by a pen. "You can just sign at the bottom, right there on the yellow tab," he said, pointing. My heart was hammering, but I forced my hand to be steady. As he pushed the pen forward, I laid my own hand flat on the first page of the document, stopping it. The motion was small, but it changed the energy in the room completely. Both of them stopped talking. They stared at my hand, resting on the paper. I lifted my eyes and met David's gaze, then Sarah's. I didn't let my eyes waver. "Thank you, dears," I said, and I was pleased to find my voice was soft, but it didn't tremble. "This is very thorough." I let a moment of silence pass. "It's so much to take in all at once," I continued, choosing my words with a care I didn't know I possessed. "I think I need to read it carefully first, by myself, when my mind is clear." The annoyance on their faces was immediate, though they tried to hide it. A flicker of frustration passed between them. This was not part of their plan. The foolish old woman was supposed to sign without question. "Oh, Mama, there's really no need for that," David said quickly, his smooth voice gaining a slight edge. "It's all very standard. We can walk you through it right now. Section by section. It will only take a minute." "No," I said. It was just one word, but it was perhaps the strongest word I had said in months. It was a word of power. "Thank you for the offer, David, but I need to do this on my own. I need to understand it for myself." They had to back down. To push any harder would be to reveal their hand. They exchanged another look, and this time I could read it perfectly. Fine, let the old woman have her moment. She won't understand it anyway. "Of course, Mama," Sarah said, her sweet voice returning. "You take all the time you need." After they left, I stood by the front door for a long time, the thick stack of papers in my hand. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the quiet of a chessboard after a surprising move has been made. I walked to the dining room table and placed the document in the very center. It sat there, thick and white and full of lies. I could feel its weight in the room, the weight of their betrayal, and the new, heavy responsibility I now had to fight back. I stared at the document on my dining room table, the neat black words blurring into meaningless gray squiggles before my eyes. I felt more lost and alone than ever before, even in the first raw days after Arthur passed away. Then, I was grieving a man I loved. Now, I was grieving the children I thought I knew, and I was doing it all by myself in a house that had started to feel like enemy territory. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was filled with the ghosts of their whispers and the weight of their lies. For a full hour, I just sat there, paralyzed by fear and indecision. What could I do? A foolish old woman against her two smart, capable children and their sharp, new lawyer. It was hopeless. I rested my head in my hands and I thought of Arthur. I thought so hard it was almost like a prayer. I could almost hear his voice, that deep, steady baritone he always used when I was worried about something. "Now, Betty," he would say, "if you're ever in a real pickle, when you can't see your way out of, you call George Abernathy. The man's as straight as an arrow and twice as sharp." The memory cut through my fog of despair like a beam of light. Mr. Abernathy. The old-fashioned lawyer my children had been so quick to dismiss. My body moved before my mind had fully caught up. I went into the study, straight to Arthur's heavy oak desk, and pulled his old, worn leather address book from the top drawer. My fingers, trembling slightly, flipped through the pages. For Abernathy. There it was, his office number, written in Arthur's elegant script. I took a deep breath and dialed, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I felt a pang of guilt, as if I were betraying my own children. But the memory of their words, "She trusts us implicitly," snuffed out that feeling right away. "Law offices of George Abernathy," a polite voice answered. "May I please speak to Mr. Abernathy?" I asked, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "This is Betty Pendleton." There was a brief pause, and then his voice came on the line, warm and familiar and blessedly calm. "Betty, what a pleasure to hear from you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. How are you holding up, my dear?" Tears immediately sprang to my eyes. It was the first time in weeks someone had spoken to me without a hint of condescension, without an agenda hiding behind their words. "Oh, George," I started, my voice cracking. I have a legal question, I suppose." "Of course, Betty, I'm here for you. What's on your mind?" His patience was a balm. "My children, David and Sarah, they've given me a document to sign," I said, looking over at the thick stack of papers on the dining room table. "They call it a power of attorney. They say it's just to help me handle the bills." "I see," he said, his voice still calm, but I could hear a new note of professional alertness. "Betty, would you mind reading a bit of it to me? Is there a title or a heading on the first page?" I walked back to the table and picked up the first page. "Yes," I said. "It says, 'Durable power of attorney for financial and real estate assets.'" The silence on the other end of the line was short, but it was electric. When he spoke again, the warmth was gone, replaced by a sharp, clear urgency that commanded my full attention. "Betty, stop. Do not sign that document. Do you understand me? Under no circumstances should your signature go anywhere on that paper." The force of his words was a shock, but a welcome one. It was validation. I wasn't crazy. My fear was real. "Why?" I whispered. "They said it was just to help." "Betty," he said, and his voice was kind but firm, like a doctor delivering a serious diagnosis. "That document does not just let them handle the bills. A durable power of attorney of that scope gives them the legal authority to do almost anything with your assets without your consent. They could sell your house. They empty your bank accounts. They could liquidate your husband's stock portfolio. In the eyes of the law, it essentially makes them the owner of your entire financial life." I sank into a dining room chair, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Everything he said confirmed the fear that had been growing in my heart. "Now, let me ask you something," he continued. "Have David and Sarah mentioned scheduling the official reading of Arthur's will with me?" "No," I said. "They told me they thought you were old-fashioned. They wanted to use their own lawyer, a man named Trevor Hayes." I heard George let out a long, slow breath. "I see," he said, and those two words were filled with a world of understanding. "Well, that is very telling, isn't it?" He paused. "Betty, listen to me very carefully. I was in the room when Arthur signed his final will and testament 5 years ago. I was the witness. That document is sealed, notarized, and locked in the safe in my office. It is the only legally binding will that exists." Whatever games your children and Mr. Hayes are playing, those games will end the moment that envelope is opened. Hope. It was a feeling so foreign I had almost forgotten what it was like. It bloomed in my chest, warm and bright. I was not alone. Arthur, my dear Arthur, had known. He had seen the truth of his children, and he had protected me. And I had an ally in George. The fear that had been paralyzing me began to recede, replaced by a cool, unfamiliar wave of resolve. "Betty," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice full of a sudden, fierce energy. "It's time to remind everyone what kind of man Arthur really was." I stood up straight, my back as rigid as a soldier's. The sweet, gentle Betty was gone. "Yes, George," I said, and my voice was no longer a whisper. It was steady. It was strong. "It is." "It's time," I repeated to myself after hanging up the phone with George. The words felt solid, real. It was time to stop acting like a fragile flower and remember that a good gardener has hands of steel when it comes to pulling up weeds. George Abernathy handled the arrangements. He called David and Sarah himself, his voice, I imagine, a perfect blend of professional courtesy and non-negotiable authority. He informed them that the formal reading of their father's will was a legal necessity and would take place in his office at 2:00 on Friday. Sarah, when she called me afterwards, was audibly annoyed. "Honestly, Mama, I don't know why George is being so dramatic about all this. It's just a formality. Our lawyer, Trevor, says these old wills are often just a starting point. The power of attorney is what really matters now." "I'm sure you're right, dear," I said, my voice as sweet as honey. "But we should go just to be respectful to your father's memory, and to Mr. Abernathy, of course." I let her think I was still playing their game, that I was just as naive as ever. Her condescension, which once would have wounded me, now felt like armor. On Friday, I dressed with care. I chose a simple, navy blue dress that Arthur had always liked. I wore the small pearl earrings he had given me for our 40th anniversary. I was not dressing for a funeral. I was dressing for a reckoning. George's office was exactly as I remembered it. A quiet, dignified space downtown, filled with the scent of old books and lemon wood polish. It was a room that felt grounded in history and truth, a world away from the slick, modern lies my children had been spinning. When I walked in, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I was on solid ground here. This was Arthur's territory. David and Sarah were already there, perched uncomfortably on the leather chairs opposite George's large mahogany desk. They looked like two sleek crows in a room full of wise old owls. "Mama," David said, standing to give me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "Good of you to come. Let's try to make this quick, shall we? We have a 3:00 meeting with Trevor to sign the final trust documents." He was trying to assert his dominance, to treat George like a clerical assistant in his grand plan. George, for his part, simply gave a slight, polite nod, completely unruffled. "Thank you all for being here," he said, gesturing for me to take the seat beside his desk. I sat, placing my purse in my lap, and folded my hands. I felt like a queen with her trusted advisor at her side. My children fidgeted. They looked at their expensive watches. They saw this as a final, tedious hoop they had to jump through before they could get what they wanted. They had their power of attorney document in David's briefcase. They believed they held all the power. They had no idea they were about to be taught a lesson in what real power, the power of a good man's love and foresight, truly looked like. George cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. He reached into a drawer in his desk and produced a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed on the back with a circle of dark red wax, bearing the unmistakable impression of Arthur's signet ring, a P for Pendleton. The sight of it made my heart ache with a fierce, proud love. It was so like him, so solid, so real. With a small, sharp letter opener, George ceremoniously broke the seal. The soft crackle of the wax was the only sound in the room. He carefully withdrew a multi-page document, tied with a blue ribbon. "Before I begin," he said, his eyes meeting David's, then Sarah's with a cool, steady gaze, "let it be known that this is the full and final last will and testament of Arthur James Pendleton, signed and witnessed in my presence on the 10th of May, 5 years ago. It has been held in a sealed and secure state in this office since that day. It is the only legally recognized final testament that exists." David smirked. I saw it. A tiny, arrogant twitch of his lips. He thought this was all meaningless theater. George put on his reading glasses, untied the ribbon, and unfolded the document. The crisp rustle of the paper was like a drum roll. He looked at me, and I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Permission granted. The curtain was about to rise. He cleared his throat once more, his voice filling the quiet, sun-dusted office. "I, Arthur James Pendleton, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." As Mr. Abernathy read, it was as if Arthur's voice was filling the room, strong and clear as the day we met. The dry legal language of the document became a vessel for his love, his foresight, and his unwavering faith in me. He began with the preamble, and it was not a list of assets, but a letter to me. "To my beloved wife, Betty," George read, his voice softening. "For 55 years, you have been my compass, my anchor, and the heart of my life. Many may mistake your kindness for fragility, but I have always known the truth. Your quiet strength has been the bedrock upon which our family was built. You are the wisest and most capable person I have ever known, and it is with the utmost confidence in your wisdom that I entrust you with the legacy of our life together." A single tear traced a path down my cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He had seen me. He had always, truly seen me. Across the room, I saw Sarah shift impatiently in her chair. David was looking at his watch again. They were waiting for the numbers. They had no interest in their father's love letter. George continued. "To my beloved wife, Betty, I leave, without condition or encumbrance, our home at 117 Meeting Street, Charleston, along with all of its contents, to do with as she sees fit." I saw David's head jerk up. His eyes met Sarah's. A flicker of confusion. This was not according to their plan. "Furthermore," George read on, his voice steady, "I bequeath to my wife, Betty, the entirety of my personal savings and checking accounts, the full balance of our shared brokerage portfolio, and my pension benefits in their totality. These assets are to be hers and hers alone, to manage, invest, or spend as she deems proper." The air in the room changed. The smug confidence began to leak out of my children, replaced by a tense, sharp shock. This wasn't a small provision. This was control. This was everything. Sarah's face had gone pale. David was staring at George as if the lawyer had suddenly started speaking in tongues. I, however, felt a warmth spread through my chest. Arthur hadn't just loved me, he had trusted me, implicitly. "To my dear children, David Pendleton and Sarah Miller," George continued, turning a page. I saw a flicker of hope return to their faces. Their moment was coming. "I bequeath the sum of $2 million each." David relaxed slightly. A smirk began to return to his lips. "To be placed in a secure and independently managed trust fund, administered by the firm of Abernathy and Sons." The smirk vanished. "The beneficiaries may draw the interest from this fund annually," George read. "However, the principal of the trust may not be accessed until each beneficiary has reached their 50th birthday. 50, David was 42. Sarah was 39. The money, the real money they had been counting on for their immediate plans, was locked away for years. Their faces were a perfect picture of disbelief turning to fury. They had been given a generous gift, but they had been denied what they truly wanted, immediate control. But my Arthur, my wise, clever Arthur, had saved his masterstroke for last. George took a deliberate pause. He looked over his reading glasses at David, then at Sarah, ensuring he had their complete, undivided attention. "Finally," he said, his voice ringing with a new gravity. "A binding condition is attached to all bequests in this testament. Should any beneficiary of this will, directly or through an agent, attempt to legally challenge its contents, or exert undue influence upon another beneficiary for financial gain, their own inheritance, both interest and principal, shall be rendered null and void. Their portion shall be donated in its entirety, in their name, to the Charleston Preservation Society." Silence. A deep, profound, and absolute silence. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of fatherly love and legal genius. He hadn't just written a will, he had written a prophecy. He had seen this coming. He had anticipated their greed, their methods, their condescension. He had used the word undue influence, a legal term for exactly what they had been doing to me for months. He had built a fortress around me. And the final, beautiful irony was that the document that gave them their inheritance was the very same one that made it impossible for them to steal mine. George neatly folded the papers and retied the blue ribbon. The reading was over. I looked at my children. They were statues of stunned rage. Their faces were pale, their mouths slightly open. They had come here for a coronation, to watch their foolish old mother sign away her life. Instead, they had been forced to sit and listen as their father, from beyond the grave, told them in no uncertain terms that he knew exactly who they were. His loving words for me were a direct refutation of their lies. His final act on this earth was to ensure that I, his Betty, would never be anyone's fool. The silence in the room was crushing. My children's smugness had vanished, replaced by a stunned disbelief that was quickly curdling into a rising, impotent rage. They stared at the document on George's desk as if it were a venomous snake. David was the first to break. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. His face was a mask of crimson fury. "This is absurd," he sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at George. "It's preposterous. My father wasn't in his right mind when he signed this. You're his lawyer, his friend. You've taken advantage of an old man." George Abernathy didn't rise to the bait. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his leather chair and tapped a single, well-manicured finger on the last page of the will. "As I stated, Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice the epitome of calm reason, "any attempt to legally challenge the contents of this will shall render your own inheritance null and void. The Charleston Preservation Society would be most grateful for your $2 million donation, I'm sure. But the choice, of course, is yours." It was a perfect, legal checkmate. David's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was a sputtering engine that had just run out of fuel. Sarah, ever the more pragmatic one, seemed to grasp their new reality quicker. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp with frantic calculation. She grabbed David's arm, pulling him back towards his chair. Then she turned her gaze on me. The fury was gone, replaced by a desperate, cloying sweetness that turned my stomach. "Mama," she began, her voice quivering with fake emotion. "Mama, you can't let this stand. You know Dad didn't mean this. He was just being dramatic. This is all too much for you to handle. We were only trying to help you, to protect you." For weeks, those words would have worked. For weeks, I would have melted, reassured by their concern. But I was not the same woman who had walked into this office. I looked at my daughter, at her practiced performance of love, and I felt nothing but a deep, hollow sadness. I took a slow, deliberate breath. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but it filled the room. It was my voice, not the timid whisper they had become used to. "Help," I repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. "Is that what you call it, Sarah?" I turned my gaze to my son. "Is that what you call it, David?" I didn't wait for an answer. "You sat in my home, a home your father and I built with love and hard work, and you decided it was yours for the taking. You talked to me as if I were a child, a simpleton who couldn't be trusted with her own life. You called me a fool in your hearts, and you were so arrogant you thought I would never notice. I let my words sink in. Their faces were a picture of shock. They were not used to being confronted. They were not used to me speaking the truth. You prepared documents to have me sign away my own life, and you called it simplifying things. You tried to take your father's legacy, a legacy built on 55 years of integrity, and twist it to serve your own impatience and greed. I shook my head, not in anger, but in profound disappointment. The money, the house, that is not what hurts the most. I would have given you anything, anything at all. All you ever had to do was ask me, your mother. I looked at them both, my two beautiful children who had become strangers to me. But you didn't want a gift. You wanted control. And in your desperate attempt to take everything, you have lost the one thing that was ever truly yours. You have lost my trust. I stood up. Think it's time for you both to leave now. It wasn't a request. It was a dismissal. The final word from the woman they had so gravely underestimated. For a moment, they just stared at me, utterly defeated. There were no more arguments to make, no more lies to tell. They had been completely and thoroughly outmaneuvered. David shot me a look of pure, childish hatred. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but whether they were tears of remorse or tears of frustration, I could not say. Without another word, they gathered their things, Sarah's purse, David's briefcase, which I knew still held the now useless power of attorney papers, and walked out of the office. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing the final, violent closing of a chapter in all of our lives. I stood there in the sudden, peaceful quiet of the room. George came and stood beside me. "Are you all right, Betty?" he asked gently. I looked around his quiet, respectable office at the will of my husband sitting on the desk, a final testament to his love. I felt the steel that had been dormant in my spine for so long, now holding me up, strong and true. A small, sad smile touched my lips. "Yes, George," I said, my voice full of a calm I hadn't felt in months. "For the first time in a very long time, I believe I am. My garden has always been my sanctuary. It was the place Arthur and I designed together, a sprawling Charleston tapestry of climbing roses, sweet-smelling jasmine, and ancient, shady oaks. But in the months after he passed, in the fog of my grief and the whirlwind of my children's help, I had neglected it. The weeds had crept in, choking the flower beds. Now I had time. The past 6 months have been a quiet unfolding. The house, once a stage for a tense and heartbreaking play, is peaceful again. It breathes with me. I've taken control of my own life, piece by piece. With George Abernathy's guidance, I found a wonderful financial planner, a kind woman who explains everything to me with respect, never once making me feel foolish. I've learned the difference between a stock and a bond. I've learned how to read a quarterly report. It turns out my mind is perfectly capable of understanding complex things when they are explained without a hidden agenda. My relationship with my children is quiet. It is the quiet of a deep, uncrossable canyon. After that day in George's office, they sent a flurry of angry letters through their lawyer, which George handled calmly and efficiently. When they realized their legal position was hopeless, the letters stopped. Now there are just formal gestures, a generic card on my birthday, a stilted 3-minute phone call on Christmas morning. They speak to me with a new, cautious respect, the kind one affords a person they have learned to fear. There is no warmth. There is no love. I grieve for that, I do. I grieve for the family I thought I had. But I do not, for 1 second, grieve for the choice I made. This morning, I was in the garden, on my knees in the soft, dark earth, pulling up the last of the stubborn weeds from around the base of the climbing roses Arthur planted for me the year David was born. The sun was warm on my back, and the air was sweet. And I finally understood the true gift Arthur had left me. It wasn't the money or the house. It was a challenge. A final act of love designed to make me find the strength he always knew I possessed. My kindness, my trust, he had never seen those things as a weakness. but he saw how others might. He saw how our own children, blinded by the easy inheritance they expected, had started to see me as a fragile doll to be put on a shelf, a footnote in my own life story. Arthur's will wasn't a punishment for them. It was a mirror, forcing them to see their own reflections clearly. And it was a key for me, unlocking the steel door of my own naivete. They thought I was a fool because I was quiet and because I chose to believe in their goodness. I know now that there is a great difference between being trusting and being blind. My eyes are open now. I am still a kind woman, I hope, but my kindness now has a fence around it, a strong one. I snipped a dead blossom from one of the rose bushes, the shears making a satisfying, clean cut. The bush was healthier for it. Sometimes, you have to prune away the parts that are dying to allow the rest to thrive. I looked at my hands, gloved and dusted with dirt. These were not the hands of a frail, incapable woman. These were the hands that had raised children, held a husband's hand as he passed, and had now taken firm hold of her own life. I looked at the beautiful, climbing roses, their blossoms turning their faces to the sun. Arthur had planted the garden, but it was up to me to make it grow, and it was beautiful. I learned something important in my garden that day, something Arthur had known all along. A person's kindness is not a weakness to be exploited. A gentle heart is not an open invitation for deceit. So, often in this world, people mistake a quiet nature for frailty. They see a woman who has spent her life tending to her family and her home, and they assume she has no strength of her own. They don't understand that the deepest roots often grow in the quietest gardens. True strength isn't always loud. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is the silent, unshakable resolve to stand your ground when you are being pushed. It is the courage to finally see the truth, no matter how much it hurts, and to act on it with grace and dignity. I wonder, have you ever had a moment like that? A time where you surprised yourself, and perhaps others, with the steel you had hidden inside. I would be so honored if you would share your own story of finding unexpected strength in the comments below. Let's create a space where we can celebrate that quiet, powerful resilience together. If you believe that the strongest hearts are often the gentlest ones, please give this video a like. And to hear more stories of resilience and the quiet vindication of those who have been underestimated, I do hope you'll subscribe. Thank you for listening, and remember to tend to your own garden.